Welcome to my first 2015 Google Hangout, continuing my series, The Intersection of Technology and Culture. I had the distinct privilege at CES this year, in the second installment of Gary Shapiro's book club, to speak with author Paul Paetz about his new book, Disruption by Design. It was, in addition to being an excellent read and a fun interview, it couldn't have been more relevant as someone that writes about technology and likes to think I try to keep on top of the trends. I would say without question the number one word that comes up over and over, to the point of borderline cliche, is disruption and what it means, how it pertains to technology and CE in particular. And I think when we think about disruption, you think about some of the people that are cultural touchstones in American business history, whether it's going back to Henry Ford, Ray Kroc with McDonald's, or Steve Jobs. They're all known as tremendous innovators that changed the shape of the way we live, but they're also, of course, were disruptors. And the notion disruption, the term disruption, I think we find has gotten overused to the point where maybe it's being misused. And Paul goes into great detail in his excellent book talking about what disruption really means and really how it pertains. So without further ado, Paul, let me bring you on board. Thanks for joining us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to really be obsessed to the point of being an expert on disruption?
Well, thanks, Sean, for the introduction and kind words about my book. I came to write the book, I guess because pretty directly because of my line of work and what I do. For the last 10 years, I've been a consultant helping companies that have disruptive potential actually realize that, and often some of the same principles apply to companies that are innovative, whether they're disruptive or not. So not all of the companies I work with are disruptors, but we do try to apply these principles. And the question that I've seen frequently is, in fact, there's been, as you said, a lot of use of the term disruption to the point of overuse and misuse, and in fact, in my estimation, at least 90% of the time when you see the word disruptive or disruption, it's being misused, and to the point that there's a bit of a backlash, and people are challenging whether it's even real and whether you can actually design a company and a product to be disruptive, or is it just an accident and it's really just a taxonomy, a way of describing a type of company rather than something you can use to predict disruption and make it happen on purpose. And so that's why I wrote the book, was really to help entrepreneurs who have disruptive potential realize that potential and execute. And more than that, I have a higher level goal as well, because I really think that our economy and there's all kinds of things out there in terms of the job situation and the enormous debt that we've accumulated as a country. Systemic problems with healthcare, with you just go through the biggest issues in the economy, the cost of education. These are enormous issues, and we have no chance of solving them without increasing not just the amount of innovation, but the amount of disruption, because disruption is really the source of all real economic growth. And that's described in the book as well, how that's true. But I just think it's necessary for the country that we stop having so many failures with startups and have more people go out on the limb, tackle big ideas, and try to make them work.
So let's break it down for the people that really are probably sitting out there right now saying, so how am I misusing the word disruption? Or when I see disruption mentioned in every article I read, what, for instance, is the difference really in terms of practical application between innovation and disruption? Or maybe you can give an example of a company that's innovative but not necessarily disruptive, or vice versa.
Sure. I think the first the answer to the first question is really that disruption has almost become a code word. It's a new buzz phrase, just simply meaning high tech to a lot of reporters. It sounds cool. A lot of innovators identify with sort of the rebel cause, and disruptive sounds like I'm a rebel. So I mean, the first thing is that to be disruptive, you actually have to have disrupted something. You have to have disrupted a market and taken on the incumbents and won. And if you're just a startup and you don't even have any customers, you're certainly not disrupting a market. You haven't even built your product yet. How can you possibly be disruptive? So when entrepreneurs tell me that they're disruptive, or they're a disruptive company, or I challenge them to, do they really mean that? Do they understand the theory that Clay Christensen outlined in his original books, and do they meet the preconditions? There are a number of things in the pattern that Christensen originally described that have to be there for disruption to be actually occurring. And if they're not, I can give you an example just from being at the CES conference this year. There were literally hundreds of startups there, and almost every single one of them told me they were disruptive. Many of them were looking for their first customers, and a very large number of them were Me Too products. You look at all the different wearable products where people are, selling blood pressure monitors or heart monitors. If you've got 20 startup companies in a category all doing the same thing with very little differentiation, the likelihood that any of them are disruptive is almost zero. And the pattern that Christensen describes is one where a company comes out of nowhere, and there's two types of disruption. It can be from the low end, where price is a primary factor. You're offering something at a significantly, often order of magnitude lower cost than the alternatives, and along with that comes a product which is functionally inferior. It often targets markets that the incumbents aren't interested in, that they can't profitably serve. And that's the low end. And the other kind of disruption is when you're basically creating a new market. So, if you're not doing one of those things, then you're not a disruptor. But more than that, if we don't define it correctly and use the term correctly, you have to understand the theory and how disruption works in order to do it on purpose. So if you're misusing the terminology, you have no chance of actually creating a strategy that will disrupt on purpose.
And I think that's one of the key themes that emerges in the book, in addition to kind of the superficial level of misapplication or misunderstanding of the actual term. I think your thesis really is that disruption is more important in some regards than innovation, because to sustain growth and to actually make a difference, to actually disrupt, one needs to have a product that is disruptive. And I still think people might not understand exactly what you're talking about. So maybe even just going back in recent history, what's an example of a company or a product that was disruptive, in ways that we can apply to today?
Oh, well, there's lots of name brand companies that you would recognize. Apple is probably the preeminent one. From the time when Steve Jobs came back as the CEO in 1997, through the 12 years that he was CEO or interim CEO, Apple brought out a string of products from the iPod to the iPhone, the iPad, iTunes, and each one of those disrupted different markets. Now, the iPhone is a great example, but The interesting thing is that I think when the iPhone first came out, a lot of people thought it was not disruptive, and in fact, Clay Christensen came out and publicly said that it was not disruptive because it was a sustaining innovation relative to a phone. And this is one of the important concepts about disruption, is that it's relative. Um, it's not an absolute thing. And if you compare it to the wrong thing, which the iPhone technically was not a phone, it was a handheld computer. And I think 7 years later, that's obvious to almost everyone. But in 2007, when it was first brought out, people were comparing it to smartphones and to the previous generation of cell phones, and saying it's just an incremental improvement on phones, rather than creating a whole new ecosystem for apps and for basically mobile computing.
Right.
And if you compare an iPhone to a notebook, which is what it was really disruptive to, then in fact it was a lower priced product. It would be considered inferior in terms of the functionality, relative to what it was really disrupting. Now, along the way, over time, it also disrupted the phone market, but the initial target was people that were trying to do computing mobily. And so when you're looking at disruption, you have to be comparing your solution to the right market. And that's often one of the big difficulties that entrepreneurs do, is understanding that if you compete with the incumbents head on, and you're comparing yourself to the wrong thing, then it's very difficult to disrupt. And it's important to understand, relative to the actual market that you're disrupting, in the case of the iPhone to computers, right, what are the differences, and why do you have both some disadvantages, and why do you have some compelling advantages? So that the fact that it was mobile was the big thing, that I could get through airport security without having to take it out and fire it up, and it was lightweight and small. You could fit it in your pocket, but basically it was a mobile internet appliance. You could do everything on that initial iPhone, and increasingly with the App Store and with it opened up a whole bunch of new markets.
So clearly, I think Apple in general is probably the key disruption story that we can point to from the last decade at least, or decade and change. But are there, looking at how this applies today, and when we talk about disruption, what I find fascinating about the work you've done and the whole notion of disruption is the idea that it's at once a positive and negative. And I think we're starting to see some blowback in terms of, well, disruption can also mean disruptive technology that impacts job performance or impairs the economy. There's two parts to that question, but first I'd say, are there certain technologies or sectors, in your estimation, that are more susceptible to disruption these days?
There's always, who's susceptible to disruption is always changing, and certainly one of the, I identify in the book 4 key factors that determine whether disruption is possible, and the most important one is the availability of an addressable market scarcity. So you do not have an opportunity to disrupt at all if there's not an addressable market scarcity. Now, scarcity doesn't mean it doesn't exist, or that there's almost nothing of it, although that can be true. Scarcity often manifests in poor customer service. So if I have no choice, if there's monopolistic control of a market, and I have to go to one supplier, it often manifests in their attitude towards profit maximization and not caring about customer service. So if you see a marketplace where customer service is dreadful, where the customers generally complain about, so airlines would be a great example. Now I'm not sure that with the available solutions or potential alternatives that we could actually disrupt the air traffic market.
Right.
Although Elon Musk's, I forget what that tube train that he's talking about to connect San Francisco and if that became a high-speed network between major cities, that could very much put a big dent in the air traffic market. So, but if you ask the question, does anybody enjoy traveling on a plane? Do any customers believe that they're getting great service? If they're not in first class, I think the answer is probably no. And if do you look forward to getting on a plane?
Yeah, I think, well, in comedians, that's been their go-to for decades, that the experience has become increasingly bad, and I think that's an obvious area that's ripe for disruption.
And if you look at markets where there's monopoly control, where products are generally agreed to be too expensive, where customer service is terrible, and you can look at some very big industries, utilities, healthcare, the education system, all fit those criteria. But as new technology comes along, it allows us to address, and this is the reason why technology is so often linked to disruption. It isn't necessary, but it's often linked to it because the technology is the enabler that allows us to address the scarcity. So, Uber is a good example. A lot of people said Uber is not disruptive, and initially I think I probably did as well because I didn't fully appreciate what scarcity they were addressing. But taxi cabs are generally cesspools of filth and you often wait just an inordinate amount of time to get picked up by a taxi driver. You don't know when they're going to arrive if you phone for one and they have to come and pick you up. And Uber is addressing all of those things. So they've addressed a scarcity. They've improved the quality of service and lowered the price. And at peak times, the price may be higher, but there's actually the availability. So if you probably had the experience of staying in New York in the rain trying to find a cab.
Right.
That was impossible.
Sure.
And probably true in D.C. as well, where you are.
Right. Well, so you're articulating kind of like the monolithic, companies or sectors that are obviously have enjoyed a monopoly or have enjoyed kind of this market share and are ripe for disruption. But what about one of the things that I really was intrigued by, not being a business major type, you talk at length in the book about it's not necessarily the companies that do things wrong, like, say, the cab companies that are ripe for disruption, but ironically, some of the companies that do things right, or right in the traditional sense. And you hammer on some of the business schools, and speaking of monolithic, kind of outmoded ways of thinking, I was really fascinated by the notion that a company or an individual, an entrepreneur that's doing all the right things by the book, may be, in today's world, doing it backwards.
Yeah, and I have to be careful in criticizing the MBA schools too much. I'm an MBA myself, but the fact remains that the majority of the curriculum in business schools is about addressing operational efficiency and quantitative methods and ways of finance and basically things that can be measured. Innovation is a much more difficult nut. It necessarily involves uncertainty, experimentation, and it's anathema to the kind of controls that the traditional business program tries to impose on a business. And Christensen made the observation in his original book that companies that had the very best management talent from the best business schools were just consistently getting disrupted. And the reason he wrote the original book, The Innovator's Dilemma, was to help big companies avoid getting disrupted. and and he lauded managers for doing all the right things. And my position is that if you're consistently getting disrupted and you're doing the same thing over and over again, then it's probably you're doing the wrong thing. And what happens is that over time, even companies that were previously disruptive, the innovative spirit and the ability to see markets from a different perspective of how customers view it and what is missing or what opportunities exist in terms of scarcities. Kodak is a great example where they were seen to be like a preeminent company in the world, and they certainly believed that the quality of their film products and their chemistry was par excellence. But what they ignored was they actually invented the digital camera in 1976, but thought that it would be a threat to their, if it actually became commercial, it would be a threat to their film and chemistry business, but also that it was low quality. And the first images were less than a megapixel, and when you compared that to the quality of image that you could create with a sophisticated camera and high quality film products, there was no comparison. Mm-hmm. But that actually is the way that disruption usually happens. The product starts out appearing as a toy or inferior on quality dimensions that the existing market cares about, but it improves over time. And obviously today, digital cameras now exceed the resolution of film. So it's completely flipped over, where film has, the only place that film has anymore is in art production.
Right.
And Kodak, was a serial disruptor themselves through most of their history, until they failed to commercialize the digital camera and let Sony become first to market, and eventually they, I think everybody knows the story of how Kodak went from their peak market cap, and actually the same year that Apple was on the ropes and near bankruptcy. That was the same year that Kodak had their peak market cap, and 15 years later, Kodak was bankrupt and Apple was the most valuable company in the world. So there's an interesting parallel between those two companies.
Yeah, that was definitely, and certainly in hindsight, a seminal moment, both culturally and for those companies. I think with a little bit of time left, we'd be remiss to not talk a little bit about. You saw the startups, the companies, the action, the activity going on at CES. That's always the hub of what's about to happen in the coming year. But I think collectively we all tend to look to Silicon Valley and the leaders, the thought leadership, and where a lot of the innovation occurs. And I think you've expressed some concerns about outmoded thinking. Are we not seeing as much disruption, disruptive thinking? Does Silicon Valley need to read your book to better understand the principles of how this can actually be? The notion of disruption can be a learned strategy, as opposed to something that just happens, 1 in a million, lightning in a bottle.
Yeah, so there's definitely, obviously Silicon Valley is still ground zero for innovation in the country, but the focus for the last several years has really been on lean thinking and on incremental. Small is beautiful. Get the least out there that you can. There's not a lot of big thinking. So when I think of big thinking, I'm thinking like Elon Musk type projects, SpaceX and the tube, whatever he's calling that. Transportation idea for rapid transit between cities. Those are big ideas, but we have other really big challenges that we face in the world. Diseases that need to be tackled, and reducing the cost of healthcare, and um, making education affordable, and if we assume that China is going to continue to develop at the rate that they have, the amount of pollution that China is pumping into the atmosphere will kill us all, and certainly will make China unlivable within our lifetimes if we don't figure out some new ways to tackle those kind of problems. Disruptions. So there's obviously scarcities that can be addressed in those markets. We aren't tackling them, and we aren't thinking big enough. Energy is another market where we're faced with sometime, probably in our lifetime, that we will run out of oil, and we haven't yet found a solution that can commercially replace it at a lower cost. That's a big market challenge, and we need to do that.
Well, it sounds like there's no shortage of areas that you're out.
No shortage or shortages.
Well, but what I think is interesting is, so to kind of come full circle, we talk about how disruption is this ubiquitous term, how often it's misapplied or misunderstood, and yet I think what you're ultimately conveying is, despite the fact that this is the buzzword right now, there's not enough disruption going on. So there's definitely a lot of areas for exploration there. Do you find yourself being confident, pessimistic, neither? What's going to come in the next year to 3 years in terms of what we see for potential disruptors?
Well, a lot of it's driven by the capital markets, and the venture capitalists. Obviously, they got burned with the .com crash, and we've been through a period where it's been possible to build things for a much smaller cost, and so the tendency has been to can I build something for $50,000, and that's okay for a startup. I mean, not everybody has to be disruptive, but we've lost the ambition, I think, in the last 10 or 15 years to really tackle big problems, and I think we do need to start tackling some of the bigger ones, and we definitely need companies that think disruptive, because we're really tasked now with replacing 100 years and more of infrastructure that we built up through the Industrial Revolution, and like I said, big problems with energy, with cost of healthcare and education, and those are huge problems that we need solutions for. And I'm sure that there's entrepreneurs out there that have ideas for how to do that. What we really need is that the venture capitalists see the opportunity there, and I think this is probably a thread that the CEA likes to carry, but government really has to get out of the way. I think part of the reason that the venture capital community has been focused on smaller things is they lack confidence in the government, and they don't want to put too much at risk and have the rug pulled out from under them.
Right.
So I think, unfortunately, a lot of it does come back to politicians and regulators being in the way of doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that's one of our primary, our goal here at CEA is quite simply stated, to grow the CE industry. And of course that incorporates innovation, it incorporates embracing the entrepreneurial community, the entrepreneurial spirit, and the notion of innovation and disruption are harmonious. And when we see the ways in which both small and large companies are embracing innovation, it typically the winners are the ones that have their fingers on the pulse of the marketplace, are providing what people want. And in addition to reiterating, I think everyone who has any interest in understanding these concepts really owes it to themselves to read Paul's book. But I come away from these conversations ultimately optimistic, because as you point out, we're not just talking about technology trends and neat, smart toys that are making our lives better, as important as those are. You're talking about things like healthcare and energy. These are huge issues that we have to address. I think the future requires innovation and requires disruption. So as a final parting shot, what do you have to say about your attitude looking toward, are we up to the challenge, are we up to the task?
Well, I'm optimistic. I mean, I like working with startups, and I see in startups just a huge energy and belief that they can change the world. And that's that's the Steve Jobs, I want to make a dent in the universe philosophy. And I think most entrepreneurs feel that they can do that, and I think the challenge to them is think bigger. Don't get caught up in trying to solve the smallest problems that have been solved by 20 other people. Go after things that are truly unique and where there are market shortages, because that's where the biggest disruptive opportunities are.
Well said. Well, Paul, thanks for joining us. Everyone that's taking the time to watch Paul's book, Disruption by Design. I read it. I learned a lot, and I think there's a lot more to learn. I think books like this necessarily help you become engaged not only with the technology industry, but what's important to us right now as our country moves forward. So, Paul, thanks for joining us. We'll look forward to having you on again at some point, and we'll be able to compare and contrast both innovation and disruption and where we stand, whether it's 6 months or a year from now.
Thanks very much, Sean. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye.